Welcome to Grimerica Goes Deep, Ancient Mystery and Lost Civilizations. This is Chapter 2, Advanced Ancient Technology with Ben from the amazing channel and site UnchartedX. Thanks for joining us, Ben.
Hey guys, yeah, real pleasure to be on. Thanks. I've been a fan of you guys, your channel, your work for quite some time.
That's great. Yeah, yours is fantastic too. It's amazing to see all your work on ancient civilization and the technological aspect and what's missing from the research. It's fantastic.
And we're going to meet you soon.
Indeed, yeah. I think in the Scablands. I signed up for the Contact the Cabin with Randall. I really enjoy Randall's work, and I know you guys run those series with him. I can't wait to get up to the Scablands, and yeah, I'm expecting that to be a fun trip.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to it as well. I mean, that one's kind of we've got another one in April that's kind of still like iffy. I mean, I'm more apt to just go through it. Graham's kind of struggling with the decision because it involves a test now, right? Like in order to go to the States and come back, we can get through, but you've got to take the test. There's no getting around that. Yeah. And whereas by May, I feel like there's more of a chance that it might just be over.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Let's hope. I've been through this loop too. I was in Egypt last. We were like we were the only tour group in Egypt, had a tour there in November, December 2020. And yeah, that was, everyone had to have the within 72-hour negative test and all that stuff. So, you got to jump through the hoops. We kind of did that. It's a little sketchy because it's because of the time constraints. You literally have to, you sort of send off, and because you send off your test result in the mail. I used a mail-in thing. And you sort of I traveled to the East Coast to hopefully this result comes back negative, and you're trying to get it just before you leave and you're waiting for that email to show it to the airline. But yeah, it worked out. But hopefully it'll settle down for May.
Yeah. One of the things that surprised me about your Egypt videos and your guide, I think his name is Yusuf or something like that. He seemed very open-minded to the stuff that you're talking about.
Well, Yusuf's epic. Yes, in fact, he's taught me an awful lot. I've known him for years. He's like the guy when I go to Egypt. He's the guy I'd recommend to anybody, because you tend to, and he's not an official tour guide. He's kind of a host. He is a guide, not officially like the way it works in Egypt. You have to have that sort of, Ministry of Antiquities certified person, and you have that in people with you. And I think that's part of that certification is always making sure that they give you that very orthodox version of what this is. And the benefit of having Yusuf there is he's super he's very well educated. He's done this his whole life. He knows the entire orthodox version of history. He's a practicing stonemason, so he knows the engineering side, and he's made a lot of his own observations over the years. So he gives you a lot of this alternative, and he looks at alternative perspective, I guess. So he's very aware of the evidence on the engineering side of what you can find on these sites. And I mean, the other thing, his father was quite famous. His father was Hakim El Ayawan, who's, if you Google him, was a really famous guide and effectively an indigenous wisdom keeper. So he founded this school. They call it chematology, but it's essentially that others, it's kind of the traditional knowledge that came down through all of the Egyptian people that has been accumulated throughout the generations of people that have been there. So a lot of it's a different version of history. It ties in a bit more closely to what the ancient Egyptians themselves said, because one of the things about ancient Egypt that people don't often realize is that our orthodox version of their civilization is not at all what they said their civilization was. They trace their roots back far further than, the beginning of the Old Kingdom, at like 3000 BC. Like the Egyptians called themselves a legacy civilization of the people that came before. So he has that perspective as well. But he's epic. And I'd highly recommend him. A couple other guys like him as well in Egypt, but you can go there and get a real authentic. And I think it would really help Egypt, because the more mystery and wonder you can inject into these things, the more people are going to want to go and see it. And I think there's a lot of that to be found there. There's, I think, less if you just, we know how this was done. The Egyptians built it all. They built the pyramid in, 25 years, and it was, done, but everyone came and worked on it for 3 months a year or whatever. We know how it was done. But the deeper you look, there's so many unanswered questions and so many aspects of this that haven't been studied appropriately yet. That they're not things that the establishment and I guess, academia that have the permits and they control the access for research seem to be very interested in chasing down. But there are people out there that are doing it, and including guys in Egypt like Yusuf.
One of the things that stands out to me in Egypt and the pyramid specifically is that, I mean, I've never been there, so maybe you can fill us in on if I'm just talking out my ass, but it seems like, I mean, they've always got flashlights when they go down into those tunnels so that they can see stuff. And I don't see how, whether it was broad daylight or otherwise, how people were seeing back there a couple thousand years ago. And the other thing I notice is I don't see a lot of like torch marks.
Yeah, that's a huge indicator, and that's a good observation. It's one that really strikes home in places like the Serapeum of Saqqara, which is probably my favorite site in all of Egypt. Really, hardly anyone goes there, and it was shut for a long time. And even in the last several years before this pandemic, it wasn't one of the most popular sites. I think it's the most fascinating. I think it's just one of the most in-your-face sort of obvious signs of advanced technology that must have been involved in some of this stuff. But that's like that. It's this underground cavern, a series of galleries. You could drive a VW down some of these tunnels, and they're perfect. And it's pitch black. Like, I've been in there. I have video of this too. You go in around the corner. They turn off the lights. Yusuf does this. We've done it in a couple of private visits there. It's pitch black, just inside around the corner, and it goes for like hundreds of meters. And there's no exhaust marks. There's no soot marks on the ceiling. There's, in some areas, these little alcoves on the wall where you can tell they've put candles, they've put offerings, and there's soot marks there. You do have some of the temples that came from definitely were like Dendera and some of these other temples that are most definitely New Kingdom and were part of that Egyptian civilization. They have soot marks on the ceiling, but there's a lot of places where there's just nothing to indicate how they lit it up. And if they didn't use fire, then how did they light it up? Because yeah.
I mean, I hate to get into supernatural speculation, but maybe they didn't light it up. I mean, we did a show with a fantastic researcher called Superhuman, and there's people teaching themselves to see without their eyes. I mean, maybe they were maybe they were advanced in that they could walk around in the dark without their eyes.
They could just carve these beautiful epigraphs on the wall or whatever they call them in the dark. They didn't even have eyes.
Didn't even have eyes. Yeah, I wouldn't rule it out. You can't rule this stuff out. I think that there's so much evidence that comes from nowadays. I'd call it adjacent fields of science to history itself. But one of the big ones that I think can apply. And this is definitely speculation, but it's an interesting path because we've look at Homo floresiensis, the Denisovans. We keep finding more and more complexity in our genetic history. Like we're the last humans left, but there were many other types of humans, and there's this other strange correlation, not just in Egypt but South America too, with elongated skulls. That's a super interesting discussion. But I think it's worth investigating with an open mind the possibility that this type of capability may have existed in either our deep ancestors or even other types of humans who I think could have been involved in a pre-Diluvian civilization or anything. We definitely are seeing more and more sophistication. Like there's a Denisovan bracelet that's something like 40,000 years old that was found in one of these caves that has a drill hole in it. That's a clear, obvious sign of tools. It's a jade bracelet that's got these drill holes and a striation that's ancient. So there may have been other forms of humans that may have had other abilities to do some of the things. Like they might have had eyes that were adjusted for the darkness. There's plenty of animals, and we know biological life can exist like that. We don't have any of their eyeballs to study, but you can't rule it out. And then there's an interesting correlation with things like the amount of underground cities, almost like Derinkuyu in Turkey, Cappadocia. There's underneath the ground at Saqqara in Egypt. People don't realize just how much is beneath the ground there, and there was quite likely a reason why people were down in the ground. Like Derinkuyu, I think in Turkey's something like 250,000 people could have lived down in these caverns.
Wow!
And why are you living down there? Like, what? It's not a defensive measure. Like, you can put water in there and you can seal. Like, it's not a good place to go if you're worried about people invading you. But it is a good place to go if the surface is going to kill you, which we know has now happened. Like things like the Younger Dryas Cataclysm. There's been solar events. There may have been a strong reason why people may have had to go underground for generations, and we might be looking at some of the evidence for that in these places. I think there's a strong possibility of that. Like at places like Saqqara, in Egypt, which is where the step pyramid is, where they think that it was like that's the first pyramid that came up. There's such a deeper level of sophistication beneath the ground than what's above it. This is a video that I'm working on at the moment. And there's something like at least 5 or 6 miles of tunnels beneath Saqqara. We don't really know how much the underground, how far it goes. And even Orthodox academics admit that there's the vast majority of ancient Egypt is beneath the ground. It's still beneath.
Wow.
So it's just all buried in sand?
Not just buried in sand, but in the bedrock. Like tunneled underneath the ground. Like there is
straight tunnels too. Like, I mean, your videos on this Serapeum are amazing. I mean, unbelievable. And the thing that strikes me about Egypt and what you seem to be doing or highlighting is that there's all these mysteries that are still more and more seem to be coming out as in this contemporary age. Like people that think that Egypt's figured out, like more and more stuff is coming up, right?
That's right. Yeah, and it's I just don't understand why the institutions and the people that have the keys to do the research and the permission. It's very difficult to do. You can get your hands on some of these objects and artifacts and things at places like the Petrie Museum in London and do some testing, but very difficult to do it in Egypt. You require a lot of partnerships. Everything has to be run through the Antiquities Ministry. They control the release of information. In fact, there's been a couple of interesting cover-ups over the years. I did a video on the Labyrinth, which is a massive structure that was discovered, I think, in 2015, or from memory, and then covered up, basically dismissed. It's a whole interesting story.
Where was that?
The Labyrinth? It's in Hawara. So there's it's an interesting story. It's probably the most famous of these great Egyptian structures that has been lost to the sands of time. And it's one that we know about because we had guys like Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus and all of these historical figures were writing about it. They witnessed it. So you have Egyptian records of it. Then you also have these other records that come from other civilizations that sort of verify this existed. And this was something incredible. It was like thousands of rooms. It was the biggest, one of the biggest underground, like talk about it, like 7 or 8 football fields, like massive multi-leveled underground labyrinth that is you were said to have needed a guide to go through there. It was multi-levels. It was all granite, like massive granite walls. There's a lot of descriptions of it. It's an incredible structure lost to the sands of time, apparently. And Flinders Petrie, it was I consider him one of the pioneering archaeologists and Egyptologists that he was the first guy to really apply modern engineering techniques to try and find stuff. And he speculated that this was located at Hawara, which is there's a pyramid, like a mud brick pyramid. There's a big sands. It's just a pyramid, like a broken down mud brick pyramid with all of this sand there today. But he dug down the sand. He found big granite blocks, and he suspected that was the foundations of the labyrinth. Now, what later happened? There was an expedition called the Matterhorn expedition. I think it was 2015, if I'm not wrong. That was done in coordination with this the Supreme Council, Antiquities, under Hawass at the time, and they went and did a bunch of ground penetrating, like 4 or 5 different techniques to look under the ground, and they found the damn thing. Like Petrie didn't find the foundations for it; he found the roof for it. He found the top layer, and what they found was that far below that there was all these images you can see of it, like a grid pattern of all of these blocks. And it's this massive. Everywhere they scanned, they found evidence for this labyrinth. And one of the issues they have is that today it's beneath where the water table is. So there's a water table that's risen, and this is due to a bunch of different sort of modern effects. The damming of the Nile, that they removed the dry season when they did that. They put the Aswan Dam in. Also irrigation. It's in an agricultural area. So there's some sort of political hot buttons around that area and the water table. And they really proved that this was here, and it correlates with all the ancient sites. It's probably one of the biggest discovery of modern times, easily. Like this was, I mean, I think it was it Herodotus said that this put the pyramids to shame. Like the pyramids paled in comparison to the wonder of the labyrinth, and they found it. But it was completely covered up. There was one public lecture, I think in late 2015 at the Ghent University in Belgium, and then. Basically, this isn't a joke. This is eventually the guy that discovered it, that ran the expedition, came out and made a little website. The website's gone now, but he said that him and his entire team were threatened with national security sanctions by the government by Hawass, if they released any information about this, and it was completely buried and covered up. If you dig hard enough, you can still find his report that shows you what they did, what they found, where it is. I have a whole video on it, but it's one of the most remarkable things, and it's just been entirely covered up. I think mostly my speculation would be because it would be so difficult for them to fix the drainage issue around this massive site and then start to excavate. But the problem is that it's beneath this salty groundwater, and it's being chewed up and eroded. Like this salty water is going to destroy it eventually. But to me, it's like this should be the number one target for. I mean, I think you could even raise the money with enough foundations. It's a tremendous project. You're talking about years of probably groundwork to fix the drainage. You'd have to move like an irrigation canal. Really, I'm sure it's super political, all of that stuff. But it could be done, and I think they could turn that. It's something that could be restored and found. But I think the more people that know about it, the better. It's so there's stuff like that. There's a tremendous amount under the ground in Egypt,
which kind of throws it out there of how are they doing that kind of stuff, and it kind of throws the timeline out the window too, if that can be the roof of it. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of stuff like that. I mean, people, when you go to Egypt today and you look at these places like Tanis and Bastet and these other places, hardly anyone's heard of them. People know Tanis from the Indiana Jones movie, The Map Room, but Karnak Temple, like these were kilometers long avenues of obelisks and giant statues, like 1,000-ton statues, single-piece statues, and all we have today, these broken down fragments of parts of it. Like the scale of what happened in ancient Egypt, in particular, is it blows your mind, because the other part to remember about this is that these sites were used as quarries for granite for thousands of years. So not only after the Egyptians themselves used the older sites as quarries, like Ramses II, quite famously, is still a big inscription at the back of the second pyramid from the quarry master that was using the granite from the second pyramid at Giza and quarrying it for Ramses' other structures. And that continued right down until like 100 years ago. And that's been going on. People have been carting stone away every single day from these places for thousands of years. And all we have left is these bare bones of what was there. But there was the scale of the amount of like massive pieces of stone that were shipped up there and moved around and it's always on the oldest sites too. That's the other thing that always gets me about. It's probably the biggest contradiction to the story of Egyptology and the history of Egypt as we know it today, like as is taught in textbooks, and that is that somehow out of nowhere, like you go from the Stone Age, essentially the pre-dynastic era, and then all of a sudden, boom, there's the Old Kingdom, and they immediately do the most amazing work that we can attribute to them. They immediately build the biggest pyramids, the greatest works, the largest pieces of stone. All of this stuff just happens like this, and then the civilization slowly declines for another 3,000 years, and that's just not how civilizations work. We look at our civilization, we ramped up to our sophistication, to our height, if that's what you want to call it.
And then you see the same thing in Rome too. See the same thing in Rome.
See the same thing in Rome,
where it kind of on a lesser scale, but where it kind of the last 2,000 years of it, they can't even comprehend how they were building these things.
Right. Yeah, and maybe we'll find ourselves there as well. But eventually, I mean, where I feel like in some ways our civilization's already started the decline. But there's a ramp to that peak. You can't just pop out of nowhere. And there's dig in further to that Old Kingdom stuff. There's so many other contradictions. Like they weren't able to, according to the Orthodox story and historians, they weren't able to quarry granite, which is utterly ridiculous. They were clearly able to quarry granite. There is massive, like 100-ton, 500-ton, big blocks of granite that they must have quarried and moved around. If you're going to say that's where the Old Kingdom came from, I think it's far more likely that the dynastic Egyptian civilization, as we know it, got a hell of a kickstart. They inherited a lot of stuff that was left lying around from their precursors. They used it. They brought it into their culture, and over time they claimed it even. But even then, they didn't. Like there's not a lot out there in terms of them saying that the pyramids were tombs. There's nothing written on them or in them.
I feel like, and I don't want to sort of get right to the end of what I wanted to say in this episode, but I'm finally at the point where I feel like with all your evidence and all the stuff that you talk about, and all the global stuff, like the stuff in South America, like let's say the one near the lake there. Now I can't remember the name of it. Yeah, those two, and then the Göbekli Tepe and Baalbek and the stuff that you're talking about in Egypt. I feel like, and maybe even the Roman stuff. Like maybe this wasn't like a ramp up to that, but it was an advanced. All of that was from before the Younger Dryas. Like maybe that was all before the Ice Age or from that. I mean, maybe it's that advanced, and that's, I mean, it even fits in with the whole giant mythology and all that too. I mean, no wonder why they thought giants were on the earth. Look at all the massive stuff that they, if they were the surviving humans from the Younger Dryas and they started, rebuilding society and finding all this massive stuff, all these underground cities and all these massive pyramids. What else would you think?
Yeah. I think that's close to the truth. I think there is a lot of correlation between. It's the megalithic stuff that I find so interesting, and there's this clear indication to me that and it's often the oldest in all these places. In South America is a good example, because you have and look, with Egypt, there's one thing I like to caveat all this with, is that there's no doubt that the dynastic Egyptian civilizations, we know they did incredible work. Like a lot of the temples that are undoubtedly from that era, they were a massively sophisticated and civilization that did incredible things. But where the question kind of comes is in the Old Kingdom part, and there's this, there's a lot more gradients. But when you get to South America and you look at, like, say, Cusco, Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, even parts of Machu Picchu, there's a much bigger gap. So you have at the bottom layer, you've got this megalithic work in South America, and you will always find these little tiny rocks all stacked up on it that's repaired with the Inca work. Because today, again, the Orthodox story in South America is the Inca more or less built everything. Some people say, well, the Kilki culture, but it's those recent, and these are very relatively primitive cultures. Like they weren't using metals very much. These guys had obsidian as on their their sticks for spears and stuff. Yeah. But there's this absolute layering that you see in South America, where you always find that megalithic stuff on the bottom, and then these Inca repairs of little bits of broken stone on top. And there's a correspondence between that work, between that and Egypt, that and Easter Island, that and Turkey. There's so many, and even some of the foundations for the Roman stuff. I mean, Baalbek is supposed to be a Roman temple linked to Jupiter, I think. That's supposedly Roman, but the foundations are massive and megalithic. And I think anyone that's looked into Baalbek and some of the theories about it, I mean, the Romans built what I think happened is they found that the foundations for it, then they built their pedestal, and then they built their temple on top of it, because they would always build their temples on a pedestal. And Baalbek's the only place anywhere that they sort of have two pedestals, but the bottom ones, those, it's the trilithon and these 1,000-ton stones that have been sort of put down close enough where you can't fit a playing card between them. And I think you're right. I think a lot of that stuff most likely is pre-Diluvian. I would say it's pre-cataclysmic. And the funny thing about all this is that it really matches up with almost every ancient culture, our culture included. It matches up with our stories, religions, traditions, everything we say about our past. Even in the Christian culture today, it's like flood myths, fire myths. You can't poke a stick at any ancient religion without finding either flood or fire or some massive cataclysm that their ancestors barely survived and then had to rebuild. They were knocked back down and had to come back up again. And this holds true for Egypt, for Native American traditions, for our tradition, for that matter. So it's all these things kind of line up. And then, we've at the same time been discovering that, our species gets older and older and older. We keep finding older and older and older examples of Homo sapiens. We find more and more complexity in our DNA. Like we now know that there's some link between South American cultures and Australasian cultures that doesn't exist in Central and North American cultures or back in the day. So it really challenges the whole, well, if the people came into the Americas through that northern land bridge, how come those people in Northern and Central America don't have this genetic indicator? There must have been a mass transit of people across the Pacific at some point in the past. Like, there's more and more complexity, and the timelines keep getting longer and longer. And I think everything sort of lines up and points towards this idea that our history on this planet is longer and more complicated than we think it is, and we be open to that possibility, and we should be investigating these things along those lines. But that's really not what happens, and there's a lot of reasons why. But that's
yeah.
Can you show us some of your favorite pieces of evidence for some of this stuff? I mean, some of the easy stuff to me that blows me away is even just the way they did the relief carvings instead of just carving stuff out, which is crazy. And then the other one is just even like some of the vases or the vases, whatever you want to call them. I mean, just some of those simple things that I feel like we can't do today out of a solid piece of granite.
Right. So here's a good example of one of those. This is one of my favorite little pieces. It's not, and there's so much to talk about with these vases, and this gets down into sort of the engineering challenges of creating objects like these. And again, these are all made. So there's tens of thousands of these, 50,000 or more.
Wow.
40,000. Oh, they're everywhere. The 40,000 or more of these were discovered beneath the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, in those 6 miles of tunnels that I was talking about.
Holy shit.
And not only there, but also like the schist disc, which we can take a look at too. That's supposedly first dynasty. You have other objects like this that are admittedly pre-dynastic, so they're even older. I think a lot of these were inherited and reused, and there's some evidence for it. But just from an engineering perspective, they're utterly remarkable. And part of this is based on the material that they're made from. So a lot of these are made from granite, schist, diorite, even corundum. So stuff that's like 6.5, 7, 8, even 9 on the Mohs scale of hardness, which tops out at 10 with a diamond, which, some of this stone is incredibly difficult to work in. Like, this is not a medium that you would choose to work in. And it's funny because in a lot of cases in the museum, these are often in the Egyptian museum, these are often in cabinets next to pottery, like clay pottery. It's like they're absolutely at opposite ends of the scale in terms of technology. So this thing's made out of granite, but what's really interesting about it is that it's so well made.
God.
It almost balances on like the tip of an egg. Like, that's how symmetrical this object is, how perfectly well made it is. And some of these vases,
that's with a handle on it still. So it's like offset on the other side to make up for the weight of that handle.
Well, it has a handle on both sides.
Does it?
In
okay.
Fact, I do have a little. Let me bring up the video, because I do have a little video of this guy. Well, here's another example. Let's let this play. So this is a stone. I guess you'd call it a vase. This is what is that? It's like a crystal form that's so thin it's translucent. The thing in the bottom. And I think this next piece, this is this vase that we were talking about. So there's a handle on both sides, but you can just see how remarkably well made it is. In fact, I have a ton of video of these things. But some of these vases where they've been broken, I mean, Petrie would say that some of this stuff has like a thickness of a playing card is how they got this stone down to, and how well worked it is. You also need the lathe, you need the wheel, you need tube drills to be able to penetrate into this sort of stone. There's no end of, and there's interesting tool marks on these. There's a long list of things that should be investigated when it comes to the manufacture of these objects. But admittedly, the people that control access to them aren't particularly interested in them. Like, they generally won't investigate how they were made. Let me see if I've got
that. To me looks like a clear cast piece.
Yeah, possibly. This is evidence of tubular drills, so being drilled into granite. This is in a big box.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so this is how they would hollow out interior machining. In fact, I've got a long video about
the
tubular drills.
The saw marks.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see the striations. What's interesting with some of these are the cores that came out of these, because these tube drills were hollow. And they would snap these cores off. And there's been some analysis done on one core in particular. It's called Petrie's core number 7. It's in the Petrie Museum in London, which is probably the only reason people have been able to actually look at it and analyze it. And that has indications of a continuous spiral groove that runs down this core of granite that's come from one of these holes. And it indicates a penetration rate into the stone 500 times greater than anything that we can achieve today. So that's not speed. That's like for every 6 inches of travel, it's going half an inch into the material. And that's, you're talking about granite. This is not an easy material to penetrate. Today, our tube drills, our core drills rotate quickly, and they're lubricated, and they sort of grind away and go down. And you can do the same thing with copper tubes. You can use wood and hornblende and other things with an abrasive powder like sand to
water jet, maybe
slowly grind it down. Yeah, but the interesting thing about this is the specific signature from the tools that's left on some of these objects.
And these are definitely objects that were old, right? They're found. So yes. These aren't like, this isn't drill marks from the early 1900s or late 1800s or something like that.
No, in fact, no, because
we're not much closer to being able to do this in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This is the problem. And for the 1,000 years before that, they're wondering how the fuck these people did that. I mean, there's historical journals of early England where they're talking about the Roman structures being godlike and how the Romans must have been gods.
That's right. And that's exactly one of the point I was going to make earlier is that it's, and this is what I find really remarkable. It's kind of a meta point about it all, but what's really remarkable is that it wasn't until guys like Petrie in the late 19th century, early 20th century, that we even developed enough industrial capability and engineering knowledge to even understand what it is we're looking at. We just didn't have the context to frame things like that, like these tubular drills, like the saw cuts. In fact, I'll show you an example here of basalt saw cuts into basalt. And I'll just skip this forward. I hope you guys can see this video. Okay.
Yep. See, I know the one thing that I consider is because we just did our last episode was with Randall Carlson about Atlantis, which he concludes is in the Azores. There used to be an Azores plateau there that has now sunken down because of the trillions and trillions and trillions of tons of ice that came off of the northern hemisphere.
Right.
So I've got to assume that there could be the same sort of effect in Egypt. That, on top of irrigation and all the other problems they have, that Egypt could just literally be sinking.
Yeah, I mean, the ancient, back in the in the Ice Age. I don't know. I actually don't know. I think that I don't know how much glaciation was happening in this area and how much it could have affected it or not.
Well, he talks about the isostatic depression, where it's just the actual loss of that weight is going to cause the rest of the globe to rebound in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, on the actual tectonic plates, right? Yeah, it's possible. I think there's definitely been some shift. I mean, that's one of the reasons why with the Great Pyramid. So just so a context on what we're looking at, look at the angle, the arc on this edge of the cut once it turns around. Jeez. This was a saw cut. This was a saw. See the curve to the blade. This was a saw cut that wasn't quite finished on this basalt block. A massive circular saw cut. This is at a place called Abu Sir. That's an Old Kingdom site. It's not somewhere that the general public can get to, but you can see the striations from the blade. You can also see the curve of the blade. This would have been a circular saw, perhaps a swing saw that was like probably 9 meters or so in diameter. Massive industrial processing. And the other thing is there's a lip on this, on the edge of this cut, where you can see the material. The thickness of the blade was something like maybe a few millimeters thick. So I don't know what material it was made from, but it's also carving through basalt, which is like a 7, I think, on the Mohs scale. Remarkable. There's a lot of these are some of just the pieces of evidence that exist in places like this.
Just lying around.
Just lying around. Yeah, out in the just in the weather. There's no end of it too. That's the other thing. There's really no end to this stuff. Let me see what else. In fact, this is that block here. You might be able to see it a little better. It's.
Oh yeah, I see the radius now.
Curve. Yeah, there's a radius curve to it.
It makes me think that this whole what got Darren and I interested in some of this stuff in the podcast is the ancient aliens thing. But now I feel like that was all just a big distraction.
Yeah, that's what it starts to seem like. Was a distraction from our. Because it doesn't even come. I'm like past the point of, you're calling all the ancient cultures idiots. I'm like, no. I think they're better than us, and this is the problem.
Yeah.
So my perspective on that is, so I don't believe you need aliens to the same sort of position that Hancock has on this. I don't believe you need aliens to explain this stuff. I think humans are capable of doing it. we had a lot more technological sophistication. These things are I think one of the key indicators that there was forms of high technology going on in the distant past. And it's the only way that you can explain the evidence that we have today. You simply cannot explain the markings and some of the objects that we have, and particularly once you get into precision. And that's a whole topic of itself, but you can't replicate that stuff or explain it using the tools that are in the archaeological record that we know came from the dynastic Egyptians, which were, copper chisels, pounding stones, flint chisels, basic plumb bobs and squares and stuff. Like but because those are the tools that have been found, that's the box that the academia and the orthodox view, they put all of this stuff into. So they're trying to cram this square peg through a round hole of the evidence. It just doesn't match the evidence. What this evidence to me indicates is that we haven't found the tools that we use to make these.
Right.
And it gets to either one of two conclusions for me overall, which is either we've greatly underestimated the dynastic Egyptians and the ancient cultures that built these megalithic works and they made these objects. So our whole picture of their history is wrong. They were far more. This extends to knowledge of the cosmos and fundamental mathematical principles of nature, the type of stuff that's encoded in the geometry of the Great Pyramid, pi, phi, golden ratio, the dimensions of the planet. The Great Pyramid's essentially a very solid replica to a scale of, I think, 48,200 to 1 of the Northern Hemisphere. They clearly knew how to measure longitude, which is a whole challenge that we didn't meet until Captain Cook's second voyage of discovery, late 18th century. So there's all this evidence that's in the objects themselves that leads you to one of two conclusions. It's either we've completely underestimated and our picture of those ancient cultures is wrong, or they didn't do it, which means they inherited this stuff. And a lot of this stuff came from an older culture that was more sophisticated. And to me, there's so much other evidence that points towards that second conclusion that is the most likely conclusion. And that's where I end up with a lot of my stuff. That's what I talk about, because I think that is the best explanation for what we see. For example, I did a video recently about this box in Lahoon. This is a granite box carved from a single piece, not as big as the boxes in the Serapeum, but this is probably the most precisely made granite box that we've ever found in Egypt, in a granite room, by the way. This is all made from granite. And this thing has tolerances down to the thousandths of an inch, as measured by Flinders Petrie. And again, he was the first guy to apply these engineering principles and try to understand how things were made. It's, I think, a discipline that's sorely lacking from today's orthodox establishment. But he couldn't measure this accurately. He didn't have the scale to be able to exactly measure how accurate this was. And this is where you really get into the mix on precision. And because precision's this devious thing, right? Precision has a relationship to function. Think about the example I like to use is integrated circuits, microchips, things like that. You only chase these crazy levels of precision when you have a return that's functional. We only spend the billions of dollars to get down to 7 nanometer processors to
if
make
it's going to do something. That's a great point.
There's a relationship. So when you look at the boxes of the Serapeum,
it doesn't have to be an aesthetic thing.
Unless
you're not going to get that precise for an aesthetic reason.
Unless it's very easy.
Exactly.
Unless it's very easy.
That's the other, unless your manufacturing process inherently delivers that sort of precision. Like the way we make cars today, the panel
they're always going to be perfect because we've designed the perfect system, which has this whole other context of problems behind it too. Now the tunnels, and you finding 40,000 vases down there, makes me think they were stashing them down there before the comet came.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
well, wait till you see is this the Serapeum now then?
This is the Serapeum. In fact, this is...
Is this your team? This is you guys?
This is me. This is back in 2016. This wasn't but this is an area you can't get into. But check out the size of this thing. This is a granite box that's been tucked around in a corner, by the way, underground in the caverns. This is a granite box with its lid on top. Actually, it's granodiorite. This is actually harder than granite. This is probably some form of cyanide or something. Absolutely incredible. It's not finished. It's not perfectly polished and finished like the other boxes, probably because it cracked. Now, when we talk about precision, exactly what you said, Darren, is if everything's ceremonial, if this is a one-time use box, if it's you're going to put the bull in it and you're going to cover it up and never look at it again, you just have to color within the lines. Like there's no reason to hollow out the inside of this to these perfectly square corners, as has been measured by Christopher Dunn. These boxes have a remarkable degree of precision and finish to their surface. Let me find another. Actually, I'll skip through this.
Which leads to either technology or it's just their process was so good that it's just like the same as us making cars or cups. Like I bet you if you measure every one of these coffee cups, they're probably all within 100 thousandths of an inch because
a couple thou.
Or a couple, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's because it's made in a dye box, which leads to the geopolymer thing, which is something I wanted to ask you about a little later because I just watched a great video that kind of starts in Egypt and then it goes to kind of Rome and Greece from there, and it kind of shows us this degradation of a geopolymer technology possibly, because they were talking about just the amount of stones. Now I'm not talking about. Clearly, there's a bunch of granite structures inside the Great Pyramid that were quarried, but I'm just talking about the 2.5 million blocks that you need to skirt the thing.
Yeah, so we can definitely get into that. I think that's I have a particular opinion on the. I'm open to it, but I do have I think some contrary evidence that the whole geopolymer theories need to address.
Awesome.
But it's definitely promising. A promising area of study is what I'd say with a lot of that.
See, when I look at that right there, I just think it's like a thing down in the basement of a nuclear power plant.
Right. It has to be a function. Yeah, a lot of this stuff is a function. What I want to say about precision, and then we can move on. There's one more thing I wanted to mention about precision, and this is that some of this work to define how precise stuff is, there's hardly been anything done since the time of Petrie.
Wow.
You have Chris Dunn, who's done some work, which his book, Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt, is a revelation. Like, I think that book's going to be...
Look at the tunnel. Just look at the tunnel.
Yeah, exactly. Straight as an arrow, too. We drive a Volkswagen down these tunnels. This is all in the bedrock beneath Saqqara. But there's recently been some work done...
Just sorry to interrupt, but so that means if it's in the bedrock beneath Saqqara, doesn't that mean it's either way older than we think it is, or they dug it down into some bedrock underneath the ground for a specific reason?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, it's
or both.
Or both.
It could be both. I don't know why specifically it's underground. It's I don't know how you determine age so much. I mean, it's the Serapeum's interesting in that there's nothing on top of it, at least not anymore.
Is there any evidence that the tunnel itself is created instead of drilled out? Kind of like when we make a mine drift or something like that?
I mean, it was definitely dug out. There's markings. There's tools something on the sides of the walls. And this is, again, you don't see evidence of soot in here. It's an incredible, this place, there's 24 of these boxes, and there's some of them weigh 50, 60, 70, even up to 100 tons with the lid.
What are the dimensions of them approximately?
It's sort of probably some of them are up like 15 feet long, and probably some of them are even longer. Some of them are up to 10 or 11 feet high with the lid.
Oh, so like that one we're looking right now, that's like 6 feet across or so, would you say?
At least, yeah.
At least.
There's a good, I think there's a clip of me.
Wow, so those are absolutely massive, and there's a lot of them down there.
It's 20, and we've never replicated one of the. It's funny. Chris Dunn did the experiment. He went and asked granite companies can you make one of these? Because again, the part that people forget about this, it's single piece of stone, single piece. Both the lid and the box come from a single piece of stone, and you're carving it from a single piece of stone. And the interior dimensions, one of the challenges in this is the relative geometry of the faces. So you're talking about perfect 90-degree bends between the walls, perfect 90-degree angle between the top of the box and the lid, such that it creates a hermetic seal when it's shut. And you can't. And the walls are also perfectly flat to within thousandths of an inch. And in fact, he takes a precision straight edge. I've got one up here. and tries to shine a light. You waft it sort of over the surface. You try to shine a light under it, and there's no light gets under it, which tells you that the surface is incredibly flat. And remember that you're carving this from a single piece of stone. So if you F this up at any point, you then have to change the whole box. And he tried to get granite companies to say, hey, can we make one of these? And they're like, well, for starters, just the cost of the stone itself, getting the piece out the ground would be astronomical. These days, millions of dollars just for the stone. And then they would need to create and design specific tools to make the box, because the way we cut granite today, they were like, we could make it from 5 flat pieces and bolt it together. And then the cost of actually trying to ship it anywhere, you're talking like, say it's 70 tons. That requires so many different permits, and you can't take that on roads. And so people underestimate how difficult it would have been to move these boxes down through these tunnels and put them in the bottom, in these alcoves that are sunken off the main gallery. And this is no joke. There is literally the biggest boxes in here, less than a foot of clearance between the width of the tunnel and the size of the box.
I mean, this is harder to believe than Göbekli Tepe, or this is almost harder to believe than the pyramids. Yeah,
the Serapeum's mind-blowing. It's the more you think about it and how this was done. This is why they're down. We can't move them out of here. We're not moving them any. I don't think we're moving them any more than the dynastic Egyptians.
So is that one just shifted off the base a tad there?
No, the lids they were all found ajar. So when
wow, someone's pried them open.
Auguste Mariette found this, I think, in the 19th century. And when he came in here, they were all found with the lids slightly ajar, except for one. There was one box that was sealed.
Wow.
And he blew it open with dynamite. And he found nothing. There was nothing inside. Nothing. Just empty.
Man, it's too bad you don't have that today, where you could like drill a little hole in and maybe get a little tube in there to suck out some of the air, or like just see what's going on inside that fucking thing.
There's a possibility that there's more of these have been discovered. It's a rumor I heard was in Egypt. There was from someone who works on the site. They were saying that they've found another gallery and it may contain up to as many as 20 more of these. And I think that's entirely possible at the Serapeum. There's no end of them. I mean, these are some of the corridors. This is a box that's left in the hallway, that's been left mid-transit. It's not a very big box, not finished either. The fact that there's unfinished boxes in here tell you that they were working on them and finishing them down in the ground, which is also mind-blowing. And again, look at the lack of soot marks that's here. Like, no,
is there any evidence that they were rushing?
That were rushing?
Like just no rushing. Like the way that you when you look around the Great Pyramid, when you had the video before outside, it seems like that stuff's just lying around everywhere. And then you got boxes underground that aren't finished, and now you got this one in the hallway. Is there any evidence that they were in a rush?
Oh, so there's definitely in a lot of places, it seems like something happened. Like there was a moment where tools were down and the work was abandoned. There is a whole number of examples of basically work that was in progress and then they left. And now I wonder what could have caused that. Perhaps a cataclysm of some sort. I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's what I was getting at, because I mean, my go-to on a hermetically sealed giant box inside underground,
it's empty,
or inside a pyramid that are empty, is that these things were full of seeds or something, and that they were literally the restart of civilization, and that people knew that that's where they were supposed to head.
Yeah, that's possible. I don't know what their function was. I am, however, convinced that they had a function then. They weren't purely ceremonial. They weren't boxes for bulls.
You don't need a seed box to be perfect either.
What about
that's my point. Yeah, with
except you do want it to be hermetically sealed, maybe.
Yeah, but you don't need that geometric precision of those internal 90-degree corners. I can dig it up and show you. I climbed into one of the boxes and get in and have a close look at one of the internal corners, and the inside surfaces are so well polished. They shine like a mirror.
Wow.
Like, it's amazing.
And do these conduct electricity? I mean, is there a way that maybe they could fill them with water and have it as a battery or something like that? Or
so that's kind of where I go in terms of, I think those are the areas we should be investigating the possible functional purpose for these, because there's definitely something going on with these underground granite boxes that are in pyramid structures. They're underground, and a lot of things that they think were pyramids, I think there's a chance they weren't in some cases, but there was something functional about these boxes. And I yeah, so my conclusion, I think, of where we are with that is that we need to be investigating it with all the power we have in terms of modern technology, because it's possible that the answer to that exists outside of our current understanding of. I mean, it's kind of arrogant in some ways to assume that we know everything that ancient people knew. And it's like, we know, if you just look at the progression of technology over the last 50 years, we know tremendous, like, look at how the world's changed in the last 50 years. There's the internet, everything. If you take a cell phone back 50 years and it's not on or anything, people have no idea of the content. They can't explain what it is. It's a piece of plastic. But you and I can't build one, but we can tell you what it is because we know what a touchscreen is. We know what wireless networking is. We know what all of the stuff that's involved that gives it meaning and purpose, so we can put it into context. And I think in 100 years or 1,000 years, we're going to understand much more about the universe, the fundamental nature, reality, all that stuff. And I think potentially some of the answers for some of these things we're looking at may exist in those realms outside of our understanding. So I think it's always interesting to speculate about what they could have been for. But ultimately, I think that some of those answers we just don't have yet. And we should be looking at these with everything we've got to try and maybe understand and learn about them. Because, like I said, that Petrie started, but there's been a documentary done by a guy named Patrice Poyard. My next video is going to be about this. I sat down and talked with him for about 3 hours last year. And he actually went and took a modern surface roughness meter that measures sort of the flatness of surfaces down to the microns. And he laser scanned a bunch of these objects and things in India and really got some tremendous results. And I think it really puts this idea that some of these objects and structures were made by hand to rest, because he's taken measurements, particularly in some of these caves in India, but also on the H blocks at Pumapunku, the boxes in the Serapeum. You're talking about single digits of microns in terms of flatness. And one of the walls in this cave has a surface roughness of around 1.5 microns. Now, a micron being 1,000th of a millimeter, like that's how flat this surface is, and over long distances. Like, this is absolutely mind-boggling. And
what
clearly
does
something else other than guys rubbing on it with rocks and sand was involved here. And the implications on history are staggering. Not just history, but technology as well, I think. So there's a lot more we should be doing to study this stuff, is what I'm saying. I think, and some of those answers may lay outside of our current realm of understanding.
I'm wondering what, like, the high-end finish for concrete is these days. Like, how smooth can they get concrete, or even a sheet of glass isn't going to be close to that.
Well, no, a sheet of glass itself, you're at you are at the same rugosity or surface roughness of glass at that point. Yeah, you are. That's about the same as just glass, which it uses gravity. It settles on a level. It's like that's perfectly formed glass. It is orders of magnitude smoother than precision concrete or anything like that. And the thing is that the reality is that the only way that in today's world that we can achieve levels of flatness like that is only with very sophisticated machinery and computer guided tools. That you cannot do this by hand. And there's a big debate in this area. There's a lot of people that will tell you that all of this stuff was done by hand, just took time and effort. It was a national project, bro. That's just what they wanted to do with their time. And some people, a lot of people out there will show you, it is possible to cut stone with copper and sand, and it is possible to grind away and do these things, and you can try and make these vases, and they kind of go on to declare victory. But there's a world of difference between that and this measurable precision that we have now on some of these objects. And I think that becomes the true test. Like, if you can make something by hand and you can measure it and you can get down to these levels of precision, then we have a discussion about it. But there's just simply every engineer and every person that's actually looked at it honestly, that has taken into account the measurable degree of precision that's in these objects. You can't come within leagues of approaching it using the tools and techniques that we have in the archaeological record, which has all these implications on the story of history, right? There was clearly something else going on back in the day. Not everything is made like this. There's obviously lots of stuff was made by the dynastic Egyptians and the other civilizations, but there is let me find an example.
Well, then you get into not only can they not have been done with the stuff the pre-dynastic Egyptians were using, you're talking about boxes that can't be done by 2021 humans.
Right. There's some stuff that is beyond. I think we're capable of doing an awful lot, but only with the use of very sophisticated tools and technology. Like
just for people that aren't sure about the history of Egypt. When you say dynastic, can you explain that the difference between dynastic and the Old Kingdom?
Let me flip back over to here. Yes, I can. Let me bring this back up. So, well, dynastic includes the Old Kingdom. So there's, in fact, I can, let me just pull up one thing here as I use as background. So when I say dynastic Egypt, I mean the dynastic periods of Egypt. So ancient Egyptians as we know them.
Right.
And that starts in the Old Kingdom. So you have the Old Kingdom, you have intermediate periods, you have the Middle Kingdom, you have more intermediate periods, you have the New Kingdom, and the Greek-Roman times. So and then it ends with Cleopatra. But so that period stretches from roughly 3000 BC right up until Cleopatra. And that's the funny thing, like all the best stuff happens at the end. So Old Kingdom being the oldest period. I do have a particular video on my channel. It's called what's it called? It's the improbable timeline of the old pyramid.
Yeah, I watched that. That's why. It's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. So and that actually lays out all these periods and it puts it all into context where these were supposed to have happened in what time frames. And again, the emphasis being that all of the most amazing stuff, the biggest stuff, the best stuff, seems to have happened in the earliest periods of history as we know it. So it's one of the big contradictions to the story of history.
Yeah.
Is that a foot I'm looking at?
Yeah, so this is it's a big sphinx. It's what they call a Hyksos sphinx. This is on the side of it. And this is, I have a billion examples of this, but this is one that I like to show and talk about. And I don't know if I have a picture of the actual object, a wider picture. I can find it, but just what you should see here is that there's an object here that's clearly been made. It's from granite. It's been polished. This is like this toes and heels, and you can see how the light is being used to reflect the ribs on the side of this thing, and the entire structure. It's all polished. It's just beautiful and perfect and polished. And then someone's come along later and quite obviously used a damn chisel on this thing, and they've carved these hieroglyphs in it. Now there's this significant difference between the quality of the stuff here with the ribs and the shine and the polish on the work and these hieroglyphs. I mean, the lines aren't even straight. And this is there's a whole box in the Serapeum and this gets at the root of the issue around the Orthodox story of Egypt and Egyptology, because it's these writings that are used to date and relate these objects.
Wow, really? So they're trying to use that?
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely. They look at and in fact the whole Serapeum, everything else, the most of our version of history as we know it is based on what's written on these objects. And they use, like, if somebody came along and did this and this has the name of a king on it, then they would say that, okay, we know from the chronicles of the Egyptians and we've got king lists and we know when that king approximately lived, then therefore he had this object built. And this whole place that this object was found in must have also been built then. And then that's what goes into the textbooks, more or less. The writing is always used to date and relate objects and structures into the story of history. And it's nonsense, because once you start to see this on objects, it's everywhere. You see these incredibly made precision boxes and objects, slabs, statues that have these poorly inscribed, obviously handmade hieroglyphs that aren't polished, that have got tool marks on them. The lines aren't straight. I mean, they developed this capability over time. They became very good at hieroglyphs, but you also don't have any of the machining marks in the hieroglyphs. You don't have any evidence of advanced technology in the writing itself. So I think the much more likely explanation for a lot of this stuff is that it was inherited. These were objects that they found or they just inherited then over time claimed. Yeah, and does
that include all the writing inside the Great Pyramid?
Yeah, I think so. Well, there's no writing inside. There's a painted on. The only thing they have in the Great Pyramid is a painted on cartouche. It uses red ochre paint. There's no carvings. There's no hieroglyphs other than that inside the Great Pyramid at all.
Was there hieroglyphs in the Serapeum that you were showing there?
There was. In fact, if you just give me one second.
And those little alcoves that you had there before we stopped talking about that, that's interesting. Yeah, I always thought there was hieroglyphs in the pyramid too, and I've been in there.
Nothing in any of the major pyramids. No, it's a whole other story about talking about the cartouche that's in the Great Pyramid in one of the relieving chambers, which seems like a very odd place for a king to put his name. And there's a whole bunch of controversy around that. There were some Germans that got in there. They got kicked out of Egypt because they were allegedly sampling it, although there's evidence that it's been sampled before that. Robert Boval has a big, long story on his website that if people are interested in this topic, they should go read. But my point is this, when it comes to that red ochre paint, and this is probably make more sense to the people that know about this story, is that it's organic. You could date it. They should go and date that paint. And I can tell you something, that for damn sure, if they dated that paint, I'm sure it's been dated because we haven't heard any results. Because for damn sure, if they dated that paint and it came back as 2500 BC, right around the time of Khufu, there would have been a huge banner raised up, and it would have been world news. They would not stop talking about this result if that had been the case. But we just don't know. You can't get up there to access it. I suspect it's been dated. There's a whole story about how that particular paint was discovered by Colonel Howard Weiss, who was exploring it at the time. He really needed a discovery to continue his funding. There's a lot of speculation that perhaps he did it in order to get funding. He might have put that cartouche on there. It's actually misspelt, like it's actually drawn poorly. It's not the right cartouche particularly. And it's also a very odd place for a king to put his name. It's basically you're putting it in an area of the pyramid that's never meant to be seen. It's a rough, unfinished area that's in these chambers above the king's chamber, upper chamber. We could talk for a long time about that cartouche. I'm very skeptical about it. I think it needs to be tested, basically. And I suspect it has been sampled. There's evidence that it has. And I suspect that because those results probably don't match the story, they'd probably come back most likely to be 19th century, around Howard Weiss's time, that we'll never get to the bottom of it. It's just long story short, there's no hieroglyphs inside these pyramids, which is not how even Old Kingdom pharaohs made their tombs. And there's lots of evidence of Old Kingdom tombs. They're all covered in hieroglyphs, covered in carving, covered in dedications. I mean, the whole Valley of the Kings and all of the Valley of the Nobles, there's Old Kingdom tombs at Giza, at Saqqara, covered in glyphs and hieroglyphs. I think these pyramids weren't tombs. There's very little evidence that they were. It's a very speculative at best to make that association. And I suspect that while the dynastic Egyptians, that whole dynastic civilization worked on the pyramids, I don't think they originally built them. Because even if they had, then it has all sorts of implications for how sophisticated they were as a civilization. They had mapped and understood the world. They understood the cosmos. They understood the dimensions of the planet. They must have understood they must have understood fundamental constants of nature, which they are not attributed as far as we know, had no idea about. Phi, pi, the golden ratio, all these things. Even the metric system is represented. There's a lot of evidence for that. But where was I going? I wanted to.
I got another question while you're looking for that. Is there an underground structure to still be discovered under the pyramid of the Sphinx as well?
In short, I think yes.
I mean, I'm asking you to speculate because I keep hearing rumors that it's there and it's been found, and then I just kind of lose interest and forget what the actual story is.
So there is a lot of evidence of that. Yeah. Let me find this one box that has. So it's actually a good example of the corridor here. It's very straight, and so there is. It's one of those things that there's been lots of controversy. I have a whole video about the Sphinx, and there's lots of historical accounts of cavities and things being discovered beneath the Sphinx. But you can go there today with a tour. Like we ran this tour, and it's a part of. We're going to be doing more in the future. You can go to something called the Osiris Shaft, which is on the causeway that connects the Sphinx to the second pyramid, the Khafra pyramid. There's a huge limestone causeway that had a roof once upon a time. But you can go in there, and if you pay the money for a special permission, you can go down. And this is 3 chambers that go down 110 feet into the bedrock. And there's boxes in these chambers. You go down this rickety old ladder and get down to the bottom layer. There is no end of, and at the bottom layer, there's tunnels that go off on the direction of the causeway that connects the pyramid to the Sphinx that apparently nobody's explored because there's nothing down there. There's also water down there, but there's tremendous evidence for that, and I think I think it's very likely that there are cavities and chambers underneath all of that, a lot of the Giza Plateau. I mean, yeah, it's something that I think we could easily solve if we just someone had the permission to go and use all of the power of modern technology and ground penetrating radar and all the other techniques that can help us to see beneath the ground. We could go and answer this question. But you've had expeditions, and Zahi Hawass and Mark Lehner have been drilling underneath the Sphinx since the 70s. They've been looking for stuff. This all gets tied up with Edgar Cayce, who was this clairvoyant guy, the Edgar Cayce Foundation, who paid for Hawass and Lehner's education. There's all sorts of connections. It's a very interesting story. A couple of really good YouTube videos on it out there. I think, and again, it's this area of this conspiracy and all this. I think I get so frustrated with the uncertainty of this, because I think we could solve these problems. I think it'd be quite easy. We could go and actually figure this out, but it just doesn't seem to be something that anyone's interested in doing.
Well, and it starts to seem like even that whole Middle Eastern area is geopolitically unstable for a reason.
There we go.
Geopolitically unstable for a reason for our entire lifetimes, because it seems like those are the places that have all the evidence of crazy stuff in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been trying to get to Lebanon, to Baalbek for a while, and it's like you said, it's tough to get to some of these areas safely. And
I'm currently looking for a boat to charter to go look for Atlantis for Randall. So
yes, in the Azores, I think that'd be a good. It's a nice spot. So, yeah. So this is just by way of background. If you're seeing this, so this is a polished granite box that has been scrawled on it with hieroglyphs, and you can so obviously see the lines on this box and the interior surface are absolutely perfect. They were capable of making objects with straight lines, but they couldn't draw a straight line on it. Yet all of this writing is used to date and relate not only these boxes. There's 2 or 3 boxes out of the 24 that have hieroglyphs on them. There's a couple of others only have a little inscription. This one is covered in them, and they consider it the most valuable because of the inscriptions. And they use these inscriptions to date and relate not only all the boxes, but the entire site into the story of ancient Egypt. And I think they date it to the Middle Kingdom. I think it's nonsense. You can see someone's been scrawling on this with a chisel. I consider this box has been vandalized, not written on. This is the equivalent of coming back and saying 5,000 years as some skyscrapers are still standing and somebody tagged one of the skyscrapers with spray paint. You're like, oh, look, little Timmy made this object, clearly. Like,
that's a great analogy.
Little Timmy.
What about didn't the tunnels have hieroglyphs on them? I thought I saw back a little ways. Were those? No, they didn't, eh?
Nope.
Oh, okay.
They almost looked more like machinery or some sort of weird thing in the walls.
So there's
little alcoves. There was the little alcoves that were
on the side here, like this. So what in the Serapeum specifically, in these alcoves with these boxes, and I think this is something else that sort of hints at a functional nature. There were these massive granite false doors. So these big pieces of granite, and they had this what's called a false door shape on it. You'll see it at the back of this box. And all of that granite, you can see it. There was one of them, like they were facing the boxes. In all the alcoves, you had on either side these big false doors, which I think are acoustically active devices. There's a few resonance chambers that use that shape that you can still experience some astonishing resonance in Egypt. And all of that stuff's been quarried and taken out. There's a couple of places. There's in one of the closed off rooms, there's a broken down granite false door that you can still see on the ground. But they've all been removed. But that's in the sides of these alcoves next to these boxes, there were these giant granite false doors, for want of a better term.
Wow.
It's a shape that was later adopted by the Egyptians as ceremonial, and but it's something that's reflected in a lot of these sort of really old bits of stone. What Yusuf's pointing out some of the tool marks here. Let me show this next one real quickly.
When's the next trip?
So it's interesting. I'm in the process of planning it right now, and I'm It'll be interesting because if it goes well, I'm going to have a very special guest coming with me. It's with somebody that we both know. So
nice.
We'll leave that for now.
Great.
Yeah, we'll see. But I'm aiming. It'll be October, so late October this year, hopefully. Well, yeah, that's the booking that I have for it. So putting that together. But yeah, this to me is we get to the end here. In fact, there's a shot that I want to show you.
Sure, and then maybe before we let you go, do you want to touch on that geopolymer question of Darren's quickly, and then we'll wrap it up?
Yeah. So look, as we turn the corner here, just look at the way the light reflects off the stone, and sort of consider this isn't a natural property of granite. Like this stone has been polished, and you can see it's almost, you can see the mirror-like finish of it as we turn the corner here, just that reflection.
I see what you mean. Yeah, granite's not naturally like that. You have to get it like that.
Well, that's what it's like in the high rises downtown. Yeah. It's super polished.
The kitchen countertops. But you can see the chicken scratch that's on it from some dude's chisel, back in the day. And likely this was the priest that owned and ran this place during the Egyptian civilization. Likely used it. They were probably selling
sacrifices
on it. Yeah. That's a false door shape. So they've drawn this on here, but this is the false door shape that you see carved into granite in a lot of examples in ancient Egypt.
Wow.
All right, let me wrap that up there then, and we'll move on to geopolymer, because that's an interesting theory, and I actually have. And I think I know the documentary that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's like 3 hours or something like that.
Yeah, it's the K 2019.
Yeah,
in fact,
that's right.
Did contact me last year about it, and I look, I'm, and there's the whole Geopolymer Institute. I think it's an area that is promising. It has some. It's a promising area of research. I think it does have some. I think the place where they've made the most progress with that is in South America, particularly at Tiwanaku, Pumapunku. There's some evidence of organic compounds in the andesite that needs explaining, but there's, to me, a few major, I guess, holes in the theory right now that I think need to be addressed, because there is a tremendous amount of evidence for the fact that it's not geopolymer, is what I would say. And first of all, I would rule out anything that's granite. Now, I know that a lot of people like to say, well, I had these giant quartz lenses and melted granite and reconstituted it. No, we have granite quarries. We have strata lines in the granite. You can see veins of different material. We've actually got the quarries, and the same thing applies for a lot of the limestone stuff. And this is a good example. This is behind the second pyramid, and what you're looking at is the actual quarry where a lot of the blocks came from. So the second pyramid, they cut down, they leveled out a ton of ground, and they took a lot of the blocks that when they made this cutting to level the ground for the second pyramid, and they used these blocks in the construction of the pyramids. And this is what's left. So this is where they were cutting down their lines and they were slicing the blocks off. And this is kind of what's left from this area of the quarry. I mean, and you also have shells and fossils in the limestone, because it's a sedimentary rock on the Giza Plateau. It was once seabed. So you have fossils and seashells and things all over the place. You see them in the ground in the bedrock. You see them in the blocks, and the blocks came from the bedrock. There's just I think it has promise. I don't like to just poo-poo the whole theory, but to my mind, there's a tremendous amount of evidence for quarrying and creation of it, of these blocks coming from the bedrock. I mean, like I said, we have quarries, we have tool marks, and geopolymer itself doesn't just purely explain the precision that's in some of these things. You still have machining marks, even so, assuming it's been cast, it's still then also been shaped somehow. And I guess the last thing that I'd say about geopolymer that does confuse me, if you are indeed making these from geopolymer, because consider how we use it today. Like we have one mold, and we make 1 billion bricks out of it, and all the bricks are the same shape and size, because that's the most efficient way to pour and use a mold. The challenge with the pyramids is that every block is a different shape and size. They're not the same size. So you're creating, the Great Pyramid has 2.3 million blocks in it. You must have had to make 2.3 million molds, because every block's a different shape and size. There's some challenges, just practical
as much work
and logical with it. And the other and I'm not ruling out the idea, particularly in South America, of things like some techniques of stone softening somehow, because when I look at those polygonal walls at Sacsayhuaman and Cusco, it feels like that's what's happened there. Just intuitively, it looks like that stone's somehow been softened and set into shape. So again, I don't rule it out. I just think it's one of those areas that needs more study. And I'm sure that whatever the answer is, it's going to be a little more nuanced than just it's all geopolymer or it's all quarried. There may be some middle ground here. That's
excellent.
Totally. Where can the viewers track you down if they want to go watch all your YouTube videos or if they want to sign up for a trip?
So unchartedx.com is probably the best place. Let me move back to this. That's my website. Everything I do does end up on the website. Obviously on YouTube as well. Like if you just search for UnchartedX on YouTube or youtube.com/c/UnchartedX, that's all my material. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram, although not super actively. I tend to just post new stuff on there, but I'm available. My email address is also attached to all of my videos, but mostly my website. Like that's probably the best place.
Awesome. Well, thanks for the great chat. Very articulate.
Yeah, this was great. Yeah, I really liked the way you had the videos playing and showed us the vases and stuff. This is fantastic. I think people will really enjoy it.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, guys. It's tough we danced across the top of a lot of stuff, but if people are interested, check out the channel. I go into depth on a lot of these topics in a lot of those videos.
Yeah, like your Serapeum, I think you did a whole series, 7 episodes on the Serapeum alone?
Something like
so,
7.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I've been, like I said, knowing you guys from back in the No Agenda days and been a fan for a long time. So I'm really happy to have got the chance to speak with you too.
Right on.
Yeah, we'll do this again too for the podcast down the road.
Definitely. Yeah, I'd love to.
Right on, Ben. Have a lovely day.
Cheers, guys. Thanks.
Yeah.